couple of weeks ago, I showed you a video about small segments and how, from a practical matter, you can actually see how most of these small segments are not related by looking at completely unrelated people like myself and my wife and seeing that, yes, we share, a handful of small segments that add up to, some certain amount. Well, in that video, or actually in the comment section of that video, there was a viewer of ours who actually asked a good question. What about phased small segments? I feel that small segments in and of themselves should not be overlooked if you are able to view them through a phased kit. Okay, so the first thing here is I want to actually use some hard data to determine whether or not this statement in the rest of it is correct or not. So I'm not going to feel anything. I'm going to actually use data and find out what the answer is. So what are we going to find out? Well, that these small segments should not be overlooked if, and this is a good qualifier that I like from this person, if you are able to view them through a phased kit. So in other words, we have to have phased data to be able to look at small segments. Let me just rephrase this as phased small segments can be useful. Phased kits, we need to have the child and one parent, at least one parent. We should always be looking at the oldest DNA. So when I'm doing matches, as far as genealogy, I'm looking at matches, I actually never use my DNA because I have my dad's DNA and I have my mom's DNA. So I'm always looking at one of those, except that I'm never looking at my dad's DNA either. I'm always looking at my grandpa's DNA and my grandma's DNA because I have both of their DNA. Now, I don't have my mom's parents' DNA, so I use hers, and I use her sister's as well in order to do my research. But you will have noticed on this channel, I use my DNA and my dad's DNA a lot. And that's because it is great for answering research questions like this. So for instance, in my case, if I am the child, well, I have my kit and I have my mom's kit and I have my dad's kit. Well, since I have my mom's kit and my dad's kit, there's no reason to even be looking at my kit. So in this case, we're really talking about a very special case when you have the child's kit and you only have one parent's kit. If you only have one parent's kit, well, then that can create a phased paternal kit, which you would use to be looking at the father's side. That is the specific instance that we're talking about here. So before you start getting in and thinking, oh, well, yeah, I can do this, remember, this is a very limited circumstance when you might be able to use this technique of phased small segments. It's when you have one parent, but not the other parent of a child, that you can look at it for the matches, or really the small segments, on that other parent. Let's go and let's set the groundwork for the data and the testing that I did with this. I want to phase a kit with the child and parents, so that way I have phased data to use. And then I want to compare that phased kit small segments with the parents kit. Because if the phased kit small segments don't show up with the parent kit, then it's a false segment still. Now, I happen to have both the mother and father, which is going to give me the best phased kit possible. Now, I know I said you should do this with just one, but since I'm doing the test and comparing it to known data, I want to have the best data possible so that I know what really the upper limit of this is. So with this, I have created a maternal child kit, which I'm going to call child M and just discard, because I'm going to just use the paternal child kit, which I'm going to compare with the father. All right, so I have two comparisons then that I'm looking at. One, I have the child small segments versus the father's segments. And this is really the baseline because these are unphased data and I'm seeing from the child how much of these segments are false. Then I have my test case. Now I'm going to look at the phase data of the small segments versus the father. And again, if the small segments that appear with the phased child do not appear in the father's information, then it is a false segment. The next thing is, how do I determine this? Well, really looking at the start and the end position of this. Now, for the child or the phased child's start position, I'm saying that this must be greater than 0.9 times the father's start position. So in other words, I'm shifting the father's start position over by 10% to account for any, differences in the kit used, where that SNP was called, anything like that. I figure 10% is probably good. I'm basically making the father's segments larger by 10% on either end. And I'm saying that the child segments have to fit within that. So since I did that for the start position, I'm also doing it for the end position. In this case, I'm adding 10% to the father's end position, and the child's end position has to be less than that. So graphically, what does this look like? Well, this looks like this, where if the child is outside of it on the start, that's a false segment. If the child is outside of it on the end, that's a false segment. If the child's completely fits anywhere within one of those father's segments, I'm calling that a true segment. Now, there are some possibilities where these aren't true segments, but for the sake of this argument, without having to go into a lot more analysis, I'm going to call every single one of those a true segment. On GEDmatch, what I did is I went and I found 102 matches that the father, the child, and the phased child all shared in common. Now, there was a lot more. I could have done this in the thousands, but I didn't want to go through all the calculations on that. 102 matches provided sufficient data to give me the answer that I was looking for. So when it comes to the number of segments examined, the child had 417 segments over these 102 people. The phased child. Now, if you'll notice, the child and the father had almost 3,500 segments over this 102 matches. So what, about 9 times, almost 10 times, 9.5 times as much matches as the phased child. So the first thing we can actually infer from this is that phasing data is great because it is taking away almost 90% of the data to even look at as far as segments. You can see that the majority of all of these cases, we're talking about small segments, things that are less than 7 centimorgans. So what was the result? Well, when I compared the phased child with the parent, with the father, 86% of those segments ended up being true segments, which is great. Now, with the small segments, it was only 78%. With the middle segments, it was 90%, and with the large segments, it was 93.5% as far as what is a true segment. With the child, so the unphased data, overall, it was only 32%, and that is mainly because, if you'll notice, the small segments, the less than 7 centimorgans, only 11% of those were found to be true segments. The mid segments, there was a little bit less than what the phased had. It was only 81 compared to 90. And the large segment was about the same. Just around 93% of those segments were found to be large segments. So I can already see just the value of using phased data in this case. Now, let's go back to what I said before about this very limited case. This is only useful when you have a child and one parent's DNA in order to look at the other parent's potential matches as far as small segments. Otherwise, you should be using the parent's DNA, the oldest DNA anyway, in which case you're not going to have phased data for that. Now, the other thing that I can see from this is if I'm looking at the small segments versus the mid segments, I can see that a significantly larger percentage of small segments for the phased child are identified as true segments, which is what you would expect, because one of the major ways that small segments are formed is by jumping between the mother and father. So if we split out the mother and the father's DNA, all of those instances of jumping between the mother and the father should disappear, which I think is what we're seeing right here. In other words, a large percentage of these segments are just jumping between the mother and the father, and we've eliminated that possibility with the phased child. However, the other thing that you will notice is the amount of small segments that are true segments is still not as much as just the mid segments. So it increases, yes, but it is not just the same as these middle segments that are just a little bit larger than that. So I would make this conclusion about this statement. Phased small segments may be as useful as unphased 7 to 10 centimorgan segments. And so you'll notice the caveat there, they may be. Now, there are many people who will argue that the cutoff for small segments really should be 10 centimorgans. And so what I would gather from this is this should not be the first place that you're looking. If you are looking at small segments because you don't have anything larger than that, I don't think it's going to be very useful at all. On the other hand, you should also recognize that if you do have some matches with some small segments attached to them as well, that you're trying to match up with others, it's really only going to be as useful as that little next step up between 7 and 10 centimorgans. Personally, when I'm looking at DNA matches, I rarely actually look at most things that are below 15 centimorgans as far as a match, simply because the number of false segments starts to increase, and you don't know necessarily that it is a false segment if you're using the practice of looking at your oldest DNA. So for instance, I can see false segments by comparing my DNA with my dad's, and I can see false segments in my dad's comparing it with my grandfather's, but I can't see which of those segments are false just by looking at my grandfather's DNA. And so that's the pitfall that small segments fall into. Phasing that data helps shift them to similar to 7 to 10 centimorgan segments, but recognize 7 to 10 centimorgan segments still are not the best thing to be able to be comparing matches with. Now, this video was actually a direct result of one of the comments from the last video. And so I've told you that with small segments, I actually want to explore this in lots of detail. And I'm going to be looking at it really based on verifiable information. In other words, in the case here, I can see which ones are false segments because I have 3 generations, actually 4 generations of DNA data to be able to look at and parse out which ones are true segments and which ones are false segments. If you have another question about false segments, or if you have a theory about false segments, or if you use false segments in a certain way and you want me to backtest it, like I've done here, to see whether or not what you think is correct about false segments, then feel free to put it in the comments below, because these make, I think, great videos as far as helping us understand whether or not there's any good uses of small segments. Now, if you'd like to see that first video about small segments, then you can watch right up here. And if you'd like to join FHF Extra, it is only $2.99 a month, and we provide all of hundreds of hours of back videos as well as new videos each month that are just for members.